Shalom, everybody. I'm Jesse Cedarbaum. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. Amos asked me to speak on the topic of inventing AD therapy. And I thought I would take the liberty of going beyond our current amyloid and tau approaches to speculate on what might be next, what might be the missing piece, taking a theme from these two wonderful children's books by Shel Silverstein. I think you can get them in Israel in Hebrew if you want. So I am currently serving as Chief Medical Officer of Immunobrain Checkpoint, a company that's developing novel immunological approaches to the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases, but also by way of disclosure, the views I'm presenting here are my own and represent my own synthesis from the background from a number of organizations with which I'm affiliated. These diagrams might be familiar to you. The left-hand one coming from a recent review by Jeff Cummings and the right-hand one from Peter van Bachhoven, both reviewing the state of Alzheimer's disease drug development and the variety of different approaches that are coming along the pike. I heartily recommend, rather than my going through these two articles, that you get a hold of them and take a look at them if you haven't read them already. But where do we stand right now? We've been basically plugging away for a long time at the amyloid and tau hypotheses. And we find that even though we've seen very minimal effects, we're not in a position to totally discard the amyloid hypothesis, at least. Here are listed the results from 3 recent amyloid antibody studies, each of them regardless of the moiety targeted, is producing about a 20% reduction in the rate of disease progression, and is also each of these drugs are reducing amyloid to a greater or lesser extent, but there appears to be a big disconnect between the amount of amyloid reduction and the magnitude of the clinical benefit. We've seen, at least with 2 of these, evidence for reduction in tau by PET as well as by CSF. But there are challenges here. This big disconnect between what we see on cognition, what we see on amyloid biomarkers. How do we make sense of this? Are we targeting the wrong epitope? Are we targeting the wrong molecular form? Or are there other components of the disease that we're not targeting with this approach that basically is going to give us a ceiling on whatever we can do with amyloid therapy? And of course, the 2 anti-tau antibodies that have read out have also shown us no efficacy either in PSP or in Alzheimer's disease. But aside from amyloid and tau, we know that there's a lot more going on in the brain of our Alzheimer's patients. Particularly, there's a war going on that's being fought by the immune system to try to control the pathological change in the brain. And we have multiple players involved in this. We have microglia, we have T cells of various different stripes, we have cytokines all roaming around the brain. And the net effect is that maybe for a while, these processes are keeping the pathology of Alzheimer's disease in check, but eventually there's a breakthrough and essentially even a lot of collateral damage, so that as time goes on, we may even be thinking that some of the immunological processes that are happening, particularly microglia and complement, which we know are involved in synapse maintenance and synapse elimination, may be going a little overboard in what they're doing. So that was a bit of speculation, but I would like you to consider the following points. that in recent years, we've learned that the brain is not an immune privileged site, and that the brain and the immune system communicate with each other regularly, both in health and in the disease. Aging is the main risk factor for all neurodegenerative diseases, as we know, and it's characterized by these two seemingly paradoxical states, which may in fact be different sides of the same coin. We have chronic inflammation, or what's called by some inflammaging, increases in CRP, other inflammatory markers, et cetera. And then there's the phenomenon of immune senescence or immune exhaustion, where there's an impaired capacity, especially of the adaptive immune system, to respond to pathological threats, which is why perhaps older people get a variety of diseases that younger people don't seem to experience unless they have a very, very strong stimulus like a genetic diathesis. And we actually have very few drugs targeting the immunopathology of neurodegenerative disorders of any type, except for multiple sclerosis, in our clinic or in our pipeline. So this is an illustration from another one of my favorite books called The War of the Worlds. And you have these big three-legged monsters attacking humanity. And when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, we can think of these as representing proteinopathy, cellular dysfunctions, and immune system dysfunction. And I would propose to you that in order to appropriately treat Alzheimer's disease, we need to target all three of these legs that are holding up the monster. One alone won't do. So this excellent review by Jeff Cummings and colleagues, now there's a more recent version of it, summarizes the state of our therapeutics development in Alzheimer's disease, looking at hundreds of trials across many different modalities, many different targets, all stages of development. But what's interesting to me that when it comes to looking at inflammatory targets, we seem to have a lot of confusion in what we really want to do. So for example, we have antibodies out there that are targeting TREM2 and CD33 with the goal of increasing activity of microglia. We also have another product out there in clinical trials that's looking to eliminate microglia from the brain entirely. And then we have another one that is in academic trials anyway, GM-CSF, trying to use this growth factor to increase Tregs to bring them in the brain to suppress immune activity. So we got some folks going up, some folks going down. What's the truth? Remains to be determined. So I'd like to present a couple hypotheses to you. This is the first one, that it's this balance between inflammaging, immune senescence, and proteopathic stress that which influences and may be the chief determinant of vulnerability to age-related neurodegeneration, as well as the rate of disease progression. And the therapeutic approaches that target the functioning of cellular elements of the immune system may offer promising means of addressing unmet needs in the treatment of neurodegenerative disorders. So let's take a look at Alzheimer's disease. And what evidence is there that the immune system isn't functioning right? After all, we don't have, like in some other diseases, very strong genetic signals for an immune diathesis in Alzheimer's disease. So on the left-hand side, we have data from Michal Schwartz at the Weizmann Institute and our colleagues, and they demonstrated in 5xFAD mice that there's actually a deficient of the immunostimulatory molecule interferon gamma, which is seen before and around the time when cognitive impairment develops in these animals, and also eventually an increase in the number of peripheral regulatory T cells. And Rudy Tanzi and his colleagues recently published a paper showing that low interferon gamma in Alzheimer's patients is predictive of cognitive decline in unimpaired older adults. And finally, over in the right-hand panel, data presented by Lynn van Os from the Amsterdam group shown at the recent ADPD conference, indicating that there's an increase in numbers of senescent immune cells in the blood in MCI and in AD patients. So then where does all this take us? Well, we're all familiar with the classic Jack diagram showing increases in A beta and then tau and then progression to structural and eventually cognitive loss in Alzheimer's disease. But maybe there's another piece to this puzzle, and that piece is immune dysfunction. So could dysfunction of the immune system be an important component of the Alzheimer's disease pathologic cascade? And I think the data that I just showed you on the previous slide says yes, and that it may be happening even fairly early in the disease process. And maybe if we can target this immune system dysfunction, we have another modality for treating Alzheimer's disease. So here's the second part of the hypothesis, that restoring brain immune communication may be beneficial in Alzheimer's disease. And this is not my hypothesis. This hypothesis comes primarily from Michal Schwartz at the Weizmann Institute and a number of her colleagues and students, and is very nicely summarized in this review in Science in 2017. Basically, the question that Michal raises is, can we use the immune checkpoints to treat Alzheimer's disease? Now, the immune checkpoints we're all familiar with. They're very efficacious to inhibit them in certain types of cancer. These consist of cell surface molecules on immune cells and antigen-presenting cells and other cells that control the activity of the immune system, that when the ligand and receptor interact, immune activity is suppressed. But when you block this, the immune system is activated, and in cancer, in certain circumstances, it's very effective. However, the good Lord, or nature, Mother Nature, depending on how you look at things, did not give us the immune checkpoints to allow cancers to invade our body. The immune checkpoints are there to maintain the immune system under tight control, preventing overreaction that may lead to autoimmune diseases while allowing appropriate activity of the immune system to combat pathogens. And so this notion that dysfunction in the system could be part of the immunopathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease, even in the absence of direct genetic links, because I firmly believe you don't have to have genetic links to understand how the body responds to a disease stimulus, leads us to the hypothesis that blocking this pathway, particularly as Michal and her colleagues have shown, and I'm going to show you the data, the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitory checkpoint is a way of gently releasing the brakes on the peripheral immune system to restore brain immune communication and thus bring about brain protection and repair. So where does some of this data come from? This is a little mouse clinical trial that was published in this paper down here from the Schwartz group at the Weizmann Institute. And what they did is they took 5 XFAD mice that are already symptomatic, already having problems learning and recalling a maze. They test them and compare them to wild-type mice. Wild-type mice learn and then remember how to find the hidden platform in the maze. The transgenic animals just can't seem to get their act together and do it. When you then take the transgenic animals and randomize them to receive either an irrelevant antibody or an anti-PD-L1 antibody, we find that a full month later, after a single injection, the treated transgenic animals are remembering the maze almost as well as the wild-type animals, whereas the control-treated animals are not. And in another set of experiments in the series, the Schwartz lab showed reductions in plaque in the treated animals and insoluble A beta, as well as soluble A beta. And further studies, I don't have time to show you here, they showed that this reduction in soluble A beta actually occurs even in the absence of TREM2 in the mice. The similar phenomenon was shown in tau transgenic animals, where after a single dose of an anti-PD-L1 antibody, you see a dose-related improvement compared to the untreated animals in maze learning performance, in this case, a T-maze, and you see reductions in tau, aggregated tau in the hippocampus and cortex. And then we look back and we ask, well, how is all this happening? And very interestingly, again, this is seen a month after treatment, even though the antibody has disappeared from the circulation by 120 hours, even at the highest dose. But we see in between is an increase in the binding of the antibody to T cells in the circulation, and an increase in activation of the T cells, giving us the notion that there's this cascade of T cell of antibody in the circulation, leading to T cell activation, leading to the magic happening in the brain. And very importantly, we see that if you do this repeatedly, at very long interdose intervals, as long as 6 weeks in these DMH tau mice, you're able to maintain cognitive improvement in these animals. These results have now been repeated by 3 outside laboratories. The most recent of these publications from the group of Zhu et al. Actually showed not only a replication of the behavioral effects, but also that anti-PD-1 administration, in this case, which is just the other side of the same checkpoint, was able to reduce tau phosphorylation by reducing GSK3 beta activation. So to sum all this up, how does this happen? We give the antibody in the bloodstream. It does not have to get into the brain to do its action, because I showed you the activation of T cells. This increases interferon gamma. This activates monocytes, which come into the brain, become macrophages, where they express pattern recognition or disease-associated molecular pattern recognition receptors such as MSR1. These receptors recognize beta-pleated sheet, other pathological proteins, prevent the formation of macroaggregates, and also prevent toxicity to neurons. And because what we're doing is we're promoting the entry of these cells who have a long residence time in the brain, we can get away with very infrequent dosing intervals. So this antibody, now termed IBC-AB002, is headed for a clinical trial, which I'm proud to say will be taking place at 4 sites in Israel, as well as sites in Europe. And in this clinical trial, we hope to show in humans the replicate this peripheral activation cascade of the PK, the T cell activation, saturation of PD-L1 binding, activation of T cells, and activation of monocytes. Uniquely among Alzheimer's disease therapies in development, the action here is in the periphery. We can quantitate the pharmacokinetics, the target engagement, and the proximal pharmacodynamics in the bloodstream. And then, of course, we'll be able to monitor the counterpart of the preclinical markers that I showed you in the CSF and in the blood, cytokines, our usual neurodegeneration, amyloid and tau markers. We can look at synaptic function using EEG activity, as well as clinical outcome measures, although in a phase 1 small clinical trial, we don't expect to see a lot of statistical significance there. So to summarize all this, Alzheimer's disease is characterized by systemic immune deficiency and suppression in mouse models and in humans. Anti-PD-L1 antibody administration has been found in animals to reduce markers of pathology and improve cognition and behavior in models of both amyloid and tau pathology. The mechanism of action involves a sequential multi-step process. Presence of antibodies required only in the periphery to start the process. The antibody does not need to get into the brain. And because of this cascade that leads to prolonged residence of cells, presumably in the brain, we can maintain dosing with very infrequent administrations. We can monitor this with a combination of peripheral and central biomarkers. And we believe that because of the short half-life and the long interdose interval, we should have less liability to produce some of the autoimmune side effects that have been seen with anti-PD-L1 antibodies in the clinic. And this trial is now gearing up to start. So I hope I've been able to convince you that directly addressing the immunopathology of Alzheimer's disease via checkpoint inhibition can tackle all three legs of the Alzheimer's monster simultaneously, getting rid of amyloid, getting rid of tau, and dealing with immune system dysfunction. If you haven't seen this excellent review in Nature, which talks about the new view of immunology, of the immunology of the brain, please read it. It's wonderful, and will give you a lot more detail on how this comes about. So I hope we found our missing piece, and our circle is now complete, and that we can now win the war of the worlds. We've made small but incremental gains with amyloid-based therapies. It remains to be seen still what the limit that we can take improving cognition to with amyloid antibodies. We haven't gotten there yet. To date, tau antibodies haven't helped us very much in Alzheimer's disease, as per the recent results announced by Roche. And again, targeting the immune system may help us find that missing piece. Just to remind you that age-related immune senescence and inflammatory stress are key risk factors here, as is age, and selectively augmenting immune function in the periphery, paradoxically, brings macrophages and Tregs into the brain and reduces inflammatory markers, decreases levels of toxic peptide aggregates, and improves function in animal models. So later this year, the phase 1 study will be starting. Here are the 4 sites in Israel. I hope these investigators or members of their team are here in the audience. And these are my colleagues at Immunobrain Checkpoint who have been working on this. Dalia Bracha is our head of clinical operations. I've put her email down in the corner there if you want to contact her for any more information about the upcoming clinical trial. And with that, I will say shalom and lahitlaot.